America has created its fair share of characters that are pop culture icons, not just here, but around the world. One such character is, of course, everybody's favorite webhead, Spider-Man. But who actually owns the character is a bit of a tangled web, to say the least. And there have been multiple versions of Spider-Man, of course, the bad 70s versions, crazy Japanese versions, and the cinematic version that we've come to know since the early 2000s. Back then, it was all Columbia Pictures. Now, it's from the studio that brought you Spider-Man Far From Home. So is it Sony? Is it Marvel? Well, it's actually a little bit of both. I'm Stephen Lewis, and let's try to untangle the confusing web that is the rights to Spider-Man. Our story begins in the 90s, during the comic book boom, where certain artists were treated like rock stars, and there were volumes of books moving unlike any had ever seen before and probably would ever see again. That went on for a while, but when that balloon popped, Marvel found themselves in some financial trouble. Now, they had sold the rights to their characters for film deals here and there, and they produced a few bad movies, thankfully most of which never saw theaters. But the biggest deal came when Marvel really needed money. They sold the rights to Spider-Man and all the characters in that universe to Sony, who at the time had considered doing a movie version of Spider-Man with one James Cameron, who everybody knows for the Terminator/Avatar franchise. It never manifested. In fact, it was supposed to have Leonardo DiCaprio as Peter Parker, and perhaps even Arnold Schwarzenegger, the Terminator himself, in the role of Dr. Octopus. Now, it would have been interesting to see what James Cameron and Lightstorm Studios would have done with that property, because from a special effects standpoint, Cameron is top-notch. However, never came to be, and kind of Spider-Man sat dead in the water for a while, until the early 2000s, when Sony relaunched the character in the Sam Raimi movies. Tobey Maguire took on the title role of Peter Parker and did a pretty good job, especially in the first movie, although a lot of people complained about the look of the Green Goblin, and they're not wrong. And then it went into a second movie with Alfred Molina as Dr. Octopus, and that still holds up as probably one of the better comic book movies of all time. It was the third one that the wheels came off. We got our first cinematic look at Venom, and it was just kind of a convoluted mess. There were even talks, though, about bringing Maguire, Dunst, and Sam Raimi back for a fourth installment that would have included the Vulture. It just never came to be, and Sony decided that they were going to reboot the franchise and put Peter Parker back in high school. Do it a little less on the special effects and make it more practical, so Andrew Garfield took on the role, and the first Amazing Spider-Man wasn't too bad. They introduced some plot points that they never really fleshed out, but most would agree it's pretty much a carbon copy of the Tobey Maguire version, only this time around they had the Lizard as a villain instead of the Green Goblin. This go around in the sequel, The Amazing Spider-Man 2, even though it arguably is still one of the best live-action versions of the costume to ever hit the screen, and Andrew Garfield is great as Peter Parker, the story just didn't deliver. It spent too much time trying to set up a Sinister Six movie that never took place, and it just didn't really flesh out anything, and therefore, once again, the franchise was dead in the water. What is the Sinister Six, you ask? Well, that's all of Spider-Man's villains coming together to basically make his life hell. They had even gone as far as to start to put that movie into play, and it was going to go for a while, right up until the Sony email hack, which basically put Sony in a pretty bad light, and some things were said that not a lot of people liked. In fact, there was even a leak that Sony had asked Marvel's advice on what they would do with Spider-Man. And about this time, the Marvel Cinematic Universe was starting to do its thing. Now, at the time, it had just been a few movies, but then as those movies started to gain success, Kevin Feige and the visionaries at Disney Marvel realized that they could tell a epic tale with several different character properties in a shared universe that would tell one giant story and lead to billions of dollars in revenue. So Sony and Marvel did the financially responsible thing and struck a deal. Sony would make some money, and Marvel would now be able to use one of its flagship characters in the rest of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. And that deal consisted of Spider-Man showing up in Civil War, Avengers Endgame, Avengers Infinity War, and a Sony-Marvel joint-produced movie called Spider-Man Homecoming, which ended up being pretty well. Tom Holland in the role, and it worked for a while anyway. Then there were rumors that that deal was starting to collapse. Some even went as far as to say that the deal was over, hence why the sequel to Spider-Man Homecoming was called Far From Home. Obviously, that was not the case, and Tom Holland's Spider-Man is still involved, but it leads to an interesting thing for Sony. In fact, Sony realized as Spider-Man was doing his thing, they'd try some other stuff. They did the animated Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, which had some really good success. It basically tells the versions of Spider-Man in various universes, and they took a shot at Venom, and even though I wasn't crazy about the first movie, it paid off. Made some money. Tom Hardy wasn't bad in the role. In fact, it made enough money to lead to a sequel that's in theaters now. Sony started to realize that they've got a lot of other characters that they can play with in the Spider-Verse that aren't necessarily related to Marvel. Jared Leto has a movie coming out called Morbius. That's a Spider-Man character, the living vampire. He's been around Spider-Man for years, and now you've got Venom, you've got Spider-Man, you've got Morbius, you've got the makings of a Spider-Verse. There's a lot of rumor that the latest Spider-Man franchise with Tom Holland, called No Way Home, is actually going to be a live-action Spider-Verse with Garfield and Tobey Maguire coming back to originate those roles. No truth to that yet, but all things are pointing in that direction. There's also a stinger at the end of Venom that's in theaters now that shows Venom being teleported into the Spider-Man universe with Tom Holland based on what Doctor Strange does in this movie. So maybe they're joining them together. Either way, it's still a little bit of a convoluted web. Now, we don't know how long this deal is going to last. What we do know is that it's still in place for now. So we'll see if Sony tries to take the Tom Holland version of Spider-Man and create their own Spider-Verse, or if they'll strike another deal which is financially lucrative for both to keep Spider-Man where he belongs in the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Either way, hopefully, that's about the tangled web that is who owns Spider-Man. I'm Stephen Lewis. Thanks for watching.